Hello, everybody. It's Friday, December the 19th, 2025. As 2025 is ending, 2026, of course, will begin. One thing to look forward to is the Football World Cup in the United States, Canada, and Mexico next year. Although some people believe that the World Cup died in 2025 with Donald Trump and Infantino and Ronaldo in the White House. My guest today is a World Cup veteran. He has a fascinating new book coming out. It's called World Cup Fever. It's about his experience at, I think, 9 World Cups. He's one of the world's leading writers and thinkers, not just on football, but on cultural and political themes. Everybody knows Simon Kuper. He's talking to us, as always, from his apartment in Paris. Simon, was 2025 the year the World Cup died?
No, absolutely not. I mean, Mussolini hosted the World Cup in 1934. He couldn't kill it. The Argentinian generals, Putin. We can certainly get through the Infantino Trump interregnum. The World Cup will outlive us all.
So are you downplaying all that? Are you suggesting that it's business as usual at the World Cup? Donald Trump trying to take seems at least, trying to take the competition over and make it the Donald Trump World Cup?
I think it will be the Donald Trump show, and there will still be World Cup football. Unfortunately, with too many countries, 48, so a lot of the football is going to be extremely mediocre. But this is not what the World Cup is about, Trump and Infantino. I agree it's a gruesome spectacle, the kind of epitome of flattery of the would-be autocrat. Again, a constant of World Cup history. In the end, you will be talking about the ball that went in off the post, the refereeing mistake, the incredible dribble. That is what survives everything else.
Simon, one of the big stories in the last couple of weeks have been the price of World Cup tickets. You, as I said, you're a veteran of the World Cup. You've been to many competitions. I hope you'll be coming to the United States, although you noted before we went live that the US now is the most expensive country in the world, certainly when it comes to sporting tickets. Are you particularly troubled by that news?
I think it's disgusting. Again, I mean, I'm a journalist. If I get my journalist accreditation for my 10th World Cup, this is not my problem, but it's not what World Cup should be about. I don't see the World Cup as a profit-making opportunity. I think the World Cup is a kind of public good. It brings the world together, it brings countries together. It gives so many people enormous amounts of pleasure. And the aim should be to break even. I mean, there was no expensive stadium building. The US and Canada and Mexico had pretty much everything in place in terms of stadiums and infrastructure. They don't need to charge these ticket prices. At the end of every World Cup, FIFA makes an enormous amount of money from TV and sponsorship rights. I guess now some, stadium owners will pocket that as well. It strikes me as very much against the spirit of the World Cup.
You wrote a wonderful piece for the Financial Times, very much connected with your book recently, The Joy of World Cup Travel. What was the first competition you went to?
My first was 1990 in Italy. I was a 20-year-old student, and a friend of mine at university had told me, to my amazement, that he could get as many World Cup tickets as we wanted. The reason being, he knew a guy whose dad worked for Mars. Mars was a World Cup sponsor, had loads of tickets. And Mars could not invite its guests, its contacts to the World Cup, because if they were American business people, they weren't interested. Asian business people didn't know there was a World Cup. It was very much a European, Latin American thing at the time. And at the time, as you'll remember, the fear of English football hooliganism was so extreme that many Europeans didn't want to go. So we got a bunch of Mars tickets. I went with 2 friends, and the stadiums we went to were not full at all.
What about your first memory of the World Cup?
I grew up in the Netherlands, and my first memory is it's the World Cup final 1978, and I'm watching in our living room in my small town in the Netherlands where I grew up. I'm not Dutch, but in football I'm Dutch. I support Holland, I always have. And Holland are playing the World Cup final against Argentina. My very first World Cup, I'm 8 years old. I'm watching it with my parents, my grandparents. I mean, that's one of the strange things about a World Cup. My mother's long dead, my grandparents are dead, but I can see us all sitting there. I remember that night of us watching the game as clearly as any other memory of my childhood. So the World Cup, I think everybody feels this, is like Proust's Madeleine. It brings you back. Every new World Cup, you remember who you watched with in the past. So I remember Dick Nonninga, the big Dutch striker, heading in the equalising goal. He actually had a flower shop. He was a semi-professional footballer with a flower shop on the German border, and he scored the equaliser in the World Cup final '78. And then, unfortunately, Argentina won.
You've written extensively, Simon, not just on football, on politics, on philosophy, on justice. My sense of the World Cup is very much bound up with a sense of morality. When I was young, the stories that stuck with me are the injustices of the World Cup. The one that particularly comes to mind, I think, is 1954, when the best team in the world, Hungary, lost to Germany in the final. Germany, of all countries, especially back then. Do you think there's a philosophical element to how we remember? I take your point on remembering family, which is, of course, important. But does the World Cup somehow become a mirror or a cause of how we think about right and wrong?
I think the World Cup is partly about what we think is important and what we think brings you greatness. And so it's partly about winning. So Germany wins World Cups, Italy wins World Cups, but it's also about beauty. And so, Johan Cruyff, the leader of the Dutch team that lost with beautiful football to Germany in '74, it's great that you had that ready and waiting for me to go. You knew
Well,
I was.
I knew. I mean, the one thing I could guarantee, Simon, in this conversation is you bring up the great man. I actually met him once in a Amsterdam restaurant, shook his hand, one of the most memorable moments of my life.
Very
And of
good.
course, he's a man of the left. God
No,
knows,
no,
he must
he's
be
not.
certainly turning in his grave at Infantino and Trump.
Yeah, I dispute this. I think Cruyff, his one political position was he was in favor of lower taxes for rich people like himself. I don't see him as a man of the left, but anyway, he was a great man.
Interesting. Yeah, go on.
And he said, look, we lost the World Cup final against the Germans, but in a sense we won because everybody remembers our beautiful football. It's not how he saw it in 1974, but it's how he came to see it. So World Cups are also about, it's a kind of competition between beauty and power, that both those things matter maybe equally. And especially for smaller countries, if you like, that can't win. So the Netherlands or Hungary can't really win World Cups. They're too small. Its beauty is something you can strive for. And then you have the superpowers who play the power game. It's a kind of analogy to world politics. In football, the superpowers are not the US and China at all. It's more Germany, Italy, Argentina, and so on.
You say the small powers can't win the World Cup, Simon, but I mean, Hungary beat Germany, I don't know, what is it, 8-3 or something in the qualifying games in 1954, and the final was very lopsided. The final between Holland and Germany reflected an odd British. Small countries can win the World Cup, can't they? Or are you suggesting they simply can't?
They can, but the last one to do it was Uruguay in 1950 in sort of the pre-modern era. And I mean, one reason why Holland and Hungary didn't win, one reason why a very weak German side reached the World Cup final in 2002, for instance, is the big countries need to win. It's what their publics expect. There is no excuse for Brazil in a World Cup. There is no second place. You have that goal, whereas the Dutch, when they came back in '74 and '78 and 2010, after their 3 defeats in World Cup finals, they were received by large, joyous crowds. Everybody was happy. People were proud of being second in the world. So to some degree, how much you win is also about how much you need to win. And this brings us to the problem of England, because England is...
Yeah, I was going to say, England's is the reverse. England needs to lose, right?
Well, the English self-image was, we're not just a big country, we're the biggest country in football because we invented the modern game. So we need to win and we should win, but then they don't win since 1966. So that's why with England, there's a genuine frustration. And with smaller countries, there isn't. And there's also a Cinderella role at World Cups, the kind of obscure, tiny country that stuns the world. So that was Cameroon in 1990, Morocco in 2022, tiny in terms of football reputation. And those countries have also succeeded. To be the Cinderella of the World Cup is a massive success. You don't have to win.
Yeah, my first memory of the World Cup, giving away my age, a little older than you, is watching the 1966 final in the south of France with a room full of Germans, and not having the nerve to watch the extra time. Simon, what can we expect in 2026 of the World Cup in America? You're probably going to cover it. You went to Qatar. You've written critically about that. You went to Russia. So as you said at the beginning, Mussolini back in the 30s, the first two World Cups were won by Italy, or certainly the 34 and 38 were won by Italy. So there's certainly always been a political element and sometimes a fascistic element. But what should we expect of this tournament in 2026 in the United States and, of course, in Mexico and Canada, although they will clearly take second place in not the top billing in this competition?
I think Trump's aim is to make it the Donald Trump show. He's not interested in soccer as such. He's not interested in the US men's team, which is not a strong team, which almost certainly is not going to win the tournament. So he can't kind of ride its glory in the way that Mussolini rode the Italian teams in 1934. For Trump, it's more about the most incredible news cycle. In terms of clicks, in terms of number of views, this is going to be the biggest media event in history. And every day he's going to be commenting, he's going to be saying something weird or upsetting and make himself the story. Also having as co-hosts countries that he is in conflict with, Mexico and Canada, that makes the story even better. He'll comment on referees, on players, on countries. And so I think us in the media, we need to some degree just resist that and say, look, it's not about him. It's not his World Cup. I think we need to keep the eye much more on the field where, this is going to just create unforgettable memories. Truly so. In the 60, 70 years' time, there's going to be people alive who will just remember whole passages of play from this coming World Cup.
Yeah, I went to some games in the last time the World Cup was held in the United States. The game that I was fortunate enough to go to was when Bulgaria beat Germany in New York. Yeah. I was also at the Italy-Nigeria game in Boston, which was also remarkable.
I was there. It's a shame we did not meet.
Yeah, and that was one of the great injustices because Nigeria was so much better than Italy. And of course, Italy got to the final, didn't have a particularly good team that year. It was the Baggio team. This is going to be a very, very different World Cup. So, I mean, as you said, you were there. Was it 94, right?
Yes, yeah.
This is going to be completely different from the last time. Last time it seemed as if there were Europeans and Latin Americans who were interested, but most Americans were completely uninterested in what was happening.
That's right. I was living in Boston and I'd go between the city and Foxborough Stadium where I was covering the games. And at Foxborough, you were in the World Cup. And then you'd come back to Boston. I'd take the bus back and forth. And most of the city was as if there was no World Cup. I remember I went to Fenway Park once with a friend to watch the Red Sox. And we said to people in the crowd, we're journalists, we're covering the World Cup. And people said, literally, what is the World Cup? So it didn't exist in most places. But when I was in the center of Boston, in downtown, when Brazil beat the US in the quarterfinals, so the hosts are knocked out by Brazil. And within 10 minutes, downtown Boston had flooded with people in yellow shirts, some Brazilians, some people pretending to be Brazilians, because, of course, the coolest thing you could be in summer 1994 was a Brazilian. But so there were this ethnic world, this immigrant world in Boston, the North End, with the Italian cafes where I used to watch football, where the World Cup did exist, but they were these little enclaves.
What do you make of how popular English football, English Premier League football in particular, has become in the United States? What's the cultural, the politics of this? I have to say I'm slightly mystified as someone who actually lives in the country.
Yeah, I mean, partly it's that football has something in it which allows it to conquer any known society. So, until the 1900s, until the 19th century, people were playing these weird, pre-modern games on the street. And then within 20 years, it's all rolled up. People are just playing football. And then when TV comes, they're just watching football. So in that sense, the US is like everyone else. The politics, I think, are it's a little bit like India, actually. Educated urbanites. And then in the US, also certain ethnic groups are, of course, the ones who are most into soccer. So there's a little bit of a Democrat-Republican. There is a Democrat-Republican divide, although it's not total on that.
What about the club versus country divide? As a North Londoner, I've never forgiven the English manager in 1966, Alf Ramsey, from leaving Jimmy Greaves out of the side. So I wasn't, when I look back, it always seems an element of injustice there.
Ramsey was quite right, wasn't he, with hindsight?
Well, if my argument always, it's probably not a very good one, is if Hurst could score 3, then Greaves could have scored 6, but we'll never know. Right. I know that the Spanish also, clubs, obviously Real Madrid and Barcelona, particularly given the political divisions within Spain, clubs seem more important than country. Do you think with the increasing power, particularly of European club football in Spain, in England, Bayern Munich, some Italian clubs, that this has become compounded and that club football now is more important than international football?
No, I don't. I think club football is much better at the top end than international football. So people are used to watching the Premier League are going to be shocked when they see, first round games like Jordan against Curacao or whatever. Most teams in the World Cup would not be good enough to play in the Premier League. But club football, Premier League, often it's on special channels you need subscriptions for. Viewing figures are much, much lower than for international football. So a bog standard World Cup game will have a higher global viewing figure than the Super Bowl. I mean, this is huge. So these people who are very obsessed with, ex-players from my team or my club are in the team or not, that's a minority. And for the World Cup, you get in every country millions and millions of people. The only soccer they watch is their national team at the World Cup. And they're not even really watching it for the soccer. They're watching it to be part of one of the last communal experiences we have. I mean, in England, where about half the population watches the biggest England games, the only program that used to get that on TV in England was the Queen's Speech. That's now, the Queen's Speech at Christmas has now collapsed in viewing. So only England football matches draw half the population together. And so people love the World Cup for that. They watch because everybody is watching. And people like you with their club team obsessions, you're a small minority. Sorry.
Well, I have to say, I'm happy to be a small minority, especially when it comes to that. You've noted that you expect this to be, or at least Donald Trump wants this to become the Donald Trump show. But there are other authoritarian leaders around the world. He's already invited the populist Slovakian leader, a man called, I think his name is Joseph Fico, to the World Cup. Orban might show up. One wonders maybe even Putin will show up, although the Russians, I don't think, are allowed in it. To what extent do you think that the tournament next year will somehow capture this division in the world between Democrats and authoritarians?
I mean, it won't. European attitudes to the US are not yet as bad as to Russia in 2018. So in 2018, a lot of Western governments did not send prime ministers and ministers to Russia.
You were there, though.
I was there, but I was not representing my nation. I was reporting on an important event, both on and off the field. So I can justify that. But for example, I don't think the UK Prime Minister went. Might be wrong about that, but many prime ministers and ministers didn't go because Russia was already then somewhat the enemy. They don't quite yet say that about the US, although their attitudes to the US now are quite similar to their attitudes to Russia were in 2018. So I think European leaders will be there. They'll be cheering on their own team. They'll be shaking hands with Donald Trump and trying to get through the meeting with as little embarrassment or damage as possible. I mean, for me, the most kind of startling image of leaders of the World Cup in recent modern history was the first game in 2018 was Russia-Saudi Arabia. And in the presidential box at the game were Putin, Infantino, and the Saudi Crown Prince MBS, laughing and joking as Russia beat Saudi Arabia, the world's worst football team at that point, 5-0. And that was a kind of vision of a non-Western world in which we didn't count, which obviously was premonitory for what the last few years have become from a European point of view. And so I think, yes, we will see Trump in the box with other terrible people and more normal leaders watching the games without him.
And what about this Infantino character? He seems to be appropriately named. Tell me about him. How typical is he of a football bureaucrat? Is he an opportunist? Is he a really bad guy? Has he got a bad press?
Being an opportunist and being a bad person are not mutually exclusive. I would say he's probably in both categories. Like many football officials, because both FIFA, the world authority, and UEFA, the European authority, are based in Switzerland, a lot of these people tend to be Swiss, partly because they're multilingual. So Infantino is very proud that he speaks, 73 languages, all of them with an accent. And so he's efficient. He's goal-oriented. He rose from a kind of humble, weird-looking bureaucrat to jumping over everyone after the FIFA corruption scandal of 2015 to take the reins, to just general surprise, because he wasn't a famous name or very charismatic guy. And so he sort of really understands power inside the organization. And then he saw the way the world was moving, that the money is first in the Gulf. So the World Cup in Qatar, he stays very close to the Qataris. He lives in Qatar for a while before. He then saw that Saudi Arabia was coming up the rails as the biggest country wanting to just pour money into soccer. So Saudi Arabia's getting a World Cup.
Next year, and the next tournament will be in Saudi.
2034 is Saudi. And then he also, because he's shameless, and he doesn't really have moral principles. And like all FIFA presidents, he sees himself as on a level with presidents of countries. He's the president of football. So in fact, it's bigger than most countries. So he moved essentially to Florida ahead of this World Cup to be near Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And he's had more meetings with Trump than almost any head of government since Trump became president again. So FIFA is always close to power. FIFA doesn't make moral judgments about the people who have power. So I would say Infantino is very much in that tradition. He needs Trump now. Trump will not be relevant to him in a year or two. But for now, Trump can't get away from him.
And vice versa. I think they're caught in a vice. What about the players and the sort of style of the players? Cristiano Ronaldo, the aged Portuguese superstar, made headlines this year going to the Oval Office to meet Donald Trump. I'm not sure he's quite as obsequious as Infantino, but there's something slightly creepy about it. But I've always found something very creepy about Ronaldo. Is he just a one-off, Simon, or does Ronaldo and his creepiness, does it reflect a different kind of culture of world stars in the 2020s?
I think with Ronaldo, it's not so much politics, it's ignorance. So he doesn't really see Trump as a politician. He doesn't know about politics. He sees Trump as an A-list celebrity, a very famous person who Ronaldo should know as fellow A-lister. And so he feels that they're meeting on a par of kind of importance. So he's not really obsequious. He sees it more as a meeting of equals than Infantino does. I mean, some footballers, because they've been shielded from society from the age of 11. So Messi doesn't know anything about politics at all. He probably doesn't know that Trump is president. Neymar, another great player of our time, was close to Bolsonaro, the Brazilian version of Trump, which is also unforgivable. Then on the other hand, Kylian Mbappe, one of the other great players of the world, is an extremely, I've interviewed him, highly intelligent, mature person who has spoken out cautiously against police violence in France, against voting for extremist parties in France. So you get them all in all shapes. And the French national team and the English national team, as you know, have been quite impressive in speaking out against racism. The England players continued, I think they still do, take a knee for Black Lives Matter years after. So there are many, many variants.
So am I being a little romantic? You already corrected me on Cruyff. You said he isn't really a man of the left. When I think of some of the great players on the stage, one thinks of the Brazilian captain Socrates as well, a man of the left. Even Maradona, I know he's
very much man of the left,
complicated character, to put it mildly, on and off the field. Has there been a shift, you think? I mean, I don't see any Maradonas or Socrates around these days.
Yeah, it's hard to think of footballers coming out for, let's say, far left leaders like
Breitner. Do you remember Breitner, the The German fullback. Wasn't he a Baader-Meinhof guy?
He said he was a Maoist. He later said that he was immature and he didn't really know what that meant. He just thought it sounded cool. Maradona, I think, comes from a kind of left-wing Peronista tradition. So when he met John Paul, the Pope in the Vatican, and John Paul talked to him about the face of the poor, Maradona said he was thinking, I'm looking all that gold in the palace and just thinking, sell the gold, mate, sell the gold. And Maradona later lived in Fidel Castro's Cuba for a while. Fidel was his best mate. So not a sophisticated thinker on politics like Socrates, but definitely a man of the left. The thing is that Maradona was poor until he was 15 or 16. So with his first match fee as a professional footballer, age 15, he buys a pair of trousers, a pair of turquoise trousers. I don't think he owns a pair of trousers until that point. So he had a real memory of being poor. Whereas now with most players, it's sort of taken care of, the very best players, by the age of 12 or so. The father is often given some kind of job. So Messi at the age of 13 gets $125,000 a year contract from Barcelona, and his whole family moves from Argentina to Barcelona. Messi was not poor. They came from the Argentinian lower middle class, but the kind of contact with poverty is quite far away for a lot of these guys. Ronaldo also, Cristiano, moves to the Sporting Lisbon Academy age 12, 13.
You've talked about the suspicion and hostility of Europe towards the United States. Of course, there's no part of the world more passionate, more important perhaps in the history of football than Latin America. Donald Trump has been unashamedly racist in terms of his attitude, but towards people from Central and Latin America who want to come to the United States. He's currently involved in a kind of war in Venezuela. Do you expect any of this to affect the Latin American attitude to the World Cup, particularly given that part of it's going to be held in Mexico?
I think that the biggest and most dramatic impact is going to be ICE and Mexicans watching Mexico games in the US. That's where, as you know, the vast majority of Hispanic immigration to the US is Mexican in origin. Mexico, stalwarts of World Cups, never doing particularly well, but nevertheless, every Mexican in the US is going to want to watch Mexico in some bar or somewhere. And so you could imagine these nightmare scenes of, you know, hundreds of people in Mexico shirts watching in a bar and ICE coming in. So maybe they won't. Maybe people won't do that for fear of ICE this time. I gather that, for example, in Miami, people live almost underground. Many Hispanics afraid of going out because of fear of being just suddenly picked off the streets. So I think that Mexican fans, it's a kind of very visible way to identify yourself as having allegiances beyond the US, which again itself is provocative in current political times in the US.
We did a show earlier this year. There's a new book out by The Athletic, The Soccer 100, with some of the journalists, including Amy Lawrence, on the book, on determining who the greatest football players have been in history. The three who come to mind are Pele, Maradona, and Messi. Should we evaluate, or do you evaluate? I'm sure you're probably not a man of lists, Simon. You probably poo-poo this idea of there being a greatest player in history. But is the world stage essential? That's the argument really for Pele, given the fact that he spent his whole career, domestic career in Brazil. Maradona, of course, has a very strong case. He had a glittering career both internationally and at a club level. But is the World Cup still the key place if you want to be the greatest player in history? And Messi, of course, up until the last World Cup, Messi's history on the international stage was far less glorious than his club history.
You know, Maradona was asked a version of the question you're asking me. He was asked, does Messi need to win a World Cup to be the greatest? And Maradona laughed and he said, it has nothing to do with it. He said, I really hope Messi wins a World Cup. This was some years before. Maradona didn't actually live to see Messi win in 2022. So Maradona said, I really hope he wins a World Cup. But it doesn't really affect the judgment because Messi has been the best week in, week out for close to 20 years. He's the most consistent great player in the history of soccer. Pelé and Maradona never really even aspired to that kind of level of consistent production. They didn't have to. They were not playing against great teams every week as Messi did in his Barcelona days. What the World Cup gives you is legend. So if Messi hadn't won in 2022, his legend would have been weaker, but his quality would not. And so you can only be the greatest of your time. You can't compare people's greatness to across eras. And these guys you mentioned, they were all the greatest of their times. Maradona wasn't the greatest every week. As the Spanish writer Santiago Segura says, Maradona was sometimes Maradona. Messi was Maradona every week. He always did it.
And of course, Maradona, your first World Cup was 1990, Maradona in 1986 in Mexico. I don't think there'll ever be a player again, Simon, who will dominate a tournament like Maradona did in 86.
Well, also because he was playing in quite a mediocre side. I mean, there were 3 or 4 wonderful players in that side, and then a lot of guys you wouldn't have got into the current Fulham side, let's say.
You've insulted Fulham fans, Simon. What?
I speak with deep respect for Fulham. One of my best friends is a Fulham fan.
Mm-hmm. You write extensively for the FT, not just about football. Has anything else happened in 2025, Simon, of any significance apart from Donald Trump's meeting in the Oval Office with Infantino of FIFA?
We've done nothing for climate for another fateful year. On the other hand, we're now closer and closer to being able to power the world on green, which I think when people look back 100 years from now, that will be the biggest issue that they will see. It's not the biggest issue that we are aware of. And then in Europe, I think the kind of divorce with the US has been finalized, that nobody's really pretending that Trump will be there for us in the face of the Russian menace. And in Europe, I think the level of, because I speak to you from Europe, so just trying to convey how things look from here, to have 3 hostile forces outside, the Russia, China, and Trump's US, all of them in different ways more powerful than Europeans. It's an experience we haven't had here for several centuries.
You wrote a very powerful piece, I thought, this week or last week in the FT about the way in which Europe is becoming like the Gulf in the way in which it's using labor from outside Europe to power its economies without giving people citizenship. In your view, is there something increasingly feudal about Europe in the way in which insiders and outsiders are so profoundly unequal?
I think that's the way we're going to move, because you had this, like in the US, anti-immigration rhetoric. But then the question is, okay, well, are we going to stop immigrants like Trump essentially has? I think in US, net immigration has gone to close to 0 for the first time in measured history. So are we going to do that? Are we going to have net immigration at 0? Well, that would mean that a lot of Europe would depopulate. 18 of the 20 fastest shrinking countries in the world are in Europe. So there wouldn't be much of an Italy in 50 years' time without immigration. There wouldn't be people to do many jobs in much of Europe. So we're going to keep immigrants coming. But the compromise is we're going to shout at them, we're going to treat them badly. Most of them will have no path ever to becoming citizens. If the French far right wins, you won't even be able to get citizenship if you were born in France. So you could live your whole life in France, be born there and never get citizenship. So I think the plan is to move to a 2-class society where, like the Gulf countries, we have very high immigration. Immigration is higher than before in Europe, but they are a second-tier caste forever. I think that's the direction of travel here.
We're going to be in the new year in a couple of weeks. We've talked about football. When you'll come back on the show, I hope to talk about this new book, World Cup Fever, that comes out in March in the US. But what else are you looking for in 2026? What matters?
I mean, I'm, like many people, quite preoccupied by the march of authoritarianism. And to me, it looks like there's an attempt at an authoritarian takeover, which is being somewhat resisted in the US by voters, by courts, by media, by demonstrators. And now the Republican Party is not really behind the leader anymore. So for Trump to override constitutional limits and run for president again would require really full support of the party. It doesn't seem to be there. So I'm now more hopeful than before that the authoritarian push in the US is going to be resisted, but I will be watching for that. I'll be watching for our electric cars and other forms of green energy really going to start taking over and becoming the norm. And in living in France, I'm going to see, can the far right stumble? Because as I sit here now, French presidential elections about 17 months away. Most people, including me, believe the far right is going to win the presidency in France. So that's something I'll have a big eye on in 2026.
And if that happens, does that essentially end the EU? Or might a far-right victory in France be rather like the far-right victory in Italy and not doesn't seem at least to make a huge amount of difference?
I think it would be worse in that Meloni, the Italian prime minister, rules in a coalition. She doesn't have that much power. She's a pragmatic figure. So Italy, yes, has remained a pro-European country. France is stronger, is more able to say to the EU, we're not going to leave. Nobody wants to leave the EU anymore. In no member country is there any desire to leave the EU. So the EU will not come to an end. But France might say, look, some of these treaties we're just going to tear up, pull out of, and try and say no to France, one of the two most powerful engines of the European Union since its beginning. So I think it would not end the EU, but it would definitely weaken the EU. Lots of things that the far right wants to do in France are against all EU laws, like giving preference to French people over other Europeans for jobs, for example.
Well, one thing we know for sure is that 2026 will be remembered for the World Cup. It'll be really interesting to see what kind of World Cup it is. I have to ask you, Simon, you'll probably dodge the question. Two questions on the 26 upcoming World Cup. Who's going to win and who would you like to win?
Who's going to win? I always get this wrong. World Cups are impossible to forecast. The best team in the world is probably Spain, but that doesn't really matter that much in such a short knockout tournament. Who would I like to win? Holland, of course. I'm now 56 and I'm less blasé than I used to be. Like in 1978, I wasn't that bothered when Holland lost the final. I thought, we'll win a World Cup soon. And now I can see a possibility that I'll live my whole life without ever seeing Holland win the World Cup. And obviously that would not be acceptable.
We're on the same page there because Van de Ven will play and even Xavi. What do you think of Xavi, by the way? The Simons.
We call him Simons, yeah. He hasn't done it for Holland.
He hasn't done it for Spurs either, so you're not alone.
There may be a consistent trend there. Yeah, he's a very gifted player. And after every Holland game, you come off thinking, was he playing? I can't remember him.
Exactly. He's almost there. Well, Simon Kuper, as always, pleasure, honor to talk to you. Your new book, World Cup Fever, is out next year. We'll have you back on in the spring, and I'm sure you'll be here in the United States in the summer, so we'll get you back on. Happy New Year, Simon. Keep well. Happy, healthy New Year. And here's to Holland in 2026. I agree.